Rome's empire ended over 1,500 years ago. Paris was the capital of an empire as recently as 1871, and France's last emperor, Napoleon III, gave the city many of its modern delights. Its wide boulevards, the Opera House, even Paris's famous sewers reflect the city building of the Second French Empire. The Paris that so many adore reflects that emperor's desire to make Paris more perfect. Emperors invest in their capital cities for many reasons, but three particular rationales stand out. First, emperors want to impress the world with their glory. Napoleon III certainly intended his Opera House, the world's largest, to showcase the strength of French culture under his leadership. Second, emperors just want to look at nice things. Who can blame them? And sometimes they have to leave their palaces and see the cities that surround them. But most importantly, emperors want to avoid the revolutions that can spark so easily in cities like Paris. Napoleon III came to power after the 1848 uprising that ousted the last French king, Louis Philippe. Investing in a capital might make that city's residents happier and less likely to rebel. And if rural Frenchmen didn't like having to pay for the city's pleasures, then so what? Uprisings in Brittany or Provence weren't going to topple the emperor. Investing in the capital city can also create defensible space, walls, fortresses, wide boulevards that make it easier for horsemen to maneuver. The term imperial city isn't meant merely to connote the capitals of empires. I use the phrase to imply any city where wealth is generated by military might, by power, not by commerce or industry. Consequently, Paris was an imperial city long before the first Napoleon turned the French Republic into an empire. Humans have been living in Paris for at least 10,000 years, but the first large-scale settlement seems to have begun about 2,200 years ago, when a tribe of Gauls, the Parisi, chose an island in the Seine, the current Ile de la Cité, as their home. That island was both defensible space and a great location for commerce. The Seine travels almost 500 miles from the hills of Burgundy to the English Channel. Despite the island's natural watery walls, the Parisi could not hold out against Caesar's legions, who took the town in 52 before the Common Era. With the Roman occupation, the Paris that we know today begins to take clearer form. The city's center moved from the island to the left bank. The safety of the city was ensured by the Roman legions. They didn't need the waters of the Seine anymore. The right bank was low and marshy. The higher left bank was drier and consequently less prone to disease. The Forum sat atop a hill about where the Rue Soufflot is today. A north-south Roman road, or cardo, today the Rue Saint-Jacques, traveled down from the Forum to the river, and it crossed the river using a wooden bridge, the forerunner of today's Petit Pont. If you continued taking the road south, you could get all the way to Spain. That north-south route was still being used hundreds of years later. The Rue Saint-Jacques was the starting point for the great medieval pilgrimage route from Paris to Compostela and the Shrine of St. James. The Romans always attended to the sanitary needs of growing cities and built aqueducts that brought water to drink and water for the famous baths at Cluny. Saint Denis brought Christianity to Paris during the Roman period. The hill where he was executed is now Montmartre, the Mount of Martyrs. As the empire's strength waned, Parisians moved back to the protection of the island. Parisians stayed in their city when Attila ravaged France. The Huns bypassed Paris, which was allegedly protected by the prayers of St. Genevieve. More tangibly, Genevieve organized the shipment of wheat to the city when it was threatened by Childeric, the founder of the Merovingian dynasty, and his Salian Franks 10 years later. Paris only became a Frankish city when Clovis I, Childeric's son, defeated the Romans in northern Gaul and entered the city with Genevieve's permission. Clovis eventually converted to Catholicism and established Paris as his capital. For 250 years, Paris would be the center of the Frankish world. The physical remnants of this Merovingian age remain, and they're primarily religious. The abbey at Saint-Germain-des-Prés, which is across from the famous café Les Deux Magots, the hangout of Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, was begun by Clovis's son. That church was built to house the stole of St. Vincent. Clovis had acquired that relic in return for lifting the siege of Zaragoza. The transfer of conquered booty to the capital is a hallmark of imperial cities. Saint-Germain-des-Prés was the first crypt of the Merovingians, but they would later build a church on the gravesite of Saint-Denis, and that church would house the bones of most of the later French kings. Saint-Denis is now a somewhat scruffy neighborhood just north of the 18th arrondissement. Pilgrims to the Basilica of Saint-Denis would sometimes stop by the church of Saint-Pierre de Montmartre, allegedly founded by the saint himself, which still contains 4 visible Merovingian columns. That older church is now overshadowed by the 19th century Basilica of Sacré-Cœur. Carolingians turned the kingdom of Clovis into the empire of Charlemagne and moved their political center eastward to Aachen, towards their new frontier. Paris languished and suffered particularly from Viking raids. To those waterborne raiders, the Seine was an avenue of conquest, not trade, and rich abbeys like Saint-Germain-des-Prés that were close to the river were ideal targets. The Capetian kings that followed were initially weaker and without large lands in modern Germany. Consequently, Paris regained its status as a capital. At their lowest point, these French kings really controlled little more than the city and its outlying areas. The Capetians were notably devout and closely allied to the Church. For 45 years, Suger was abbot of Saint-Denis, and for many decades he was a chief advisor to both Louis VI and Louis VII. In a sense, he was the Cardinal Richelieu of his age, even serving briefly as the country's regent when Louis VII was off on crusade. The Capetians did like to crusade. Suger built his own abbey and supported the construction of Notre Dame, still one of the most memorable monuments of Paris. The famous University of Paris, the Sorbonne, appears to have begun as a cathedral school associated with Notre Dame. The university itself was chartered by Louis VII's son, Philip II, or Philip Augustus if you need the imperial theme driven in. It was Philip who brought real power back to Paris. By 1229, the Pope Gregory IX was praising the city as the mother of the sciences and a city of letters. Paris has benefited for centuries because the Capetians decided to invest in knowledge as well as monuments. Not every imperial city has been so fortunate. Philip Augustus matched wits and swords successfully with his Plantagenet rivals, Henry II, Richard the Lionheart, and especially against hapless King John. France was back, and Paris was its core. Philip Augustus built the fortress of the Louvre and the walls around the city, some of which are still visible in the Jardin of St. Paul. Imperial cities often needed strong defenses. His grandson, Louis IX, Saint Louis, was another successful conqueror and builder. He also brought back prizes from abroad, most notably the Crown of Thorns, which had been pawned to the Venetians by the Emperor in Constantinople. The achingly beautiful church of Sainte-Chapelle was built by the Saint King to house that crown. Philip the Fair, Philip IV, St. Louis's grandson, rebuilt the royal palace on the Ile de la Cité, and two of his halls still sit within the Ministry of Justice. These later Capetians were powerful kings, able to control the riches of most of France, and those riches were translated into the Louvre, into Notre Dame, into the University of Paris, three of the city's most visible landmarks. In the 1300s, Paris fell victim to plague, and the city fell to the English in 1418. The child king of England, Henry VI, was crowned King of France in Notre Dame in 1431. Joan of Arc herself was unable to retake the city. But eventually, Paris became capital of France again, and the French monarchs returned to the city, ending the wars of religion which tore the country apart. Henry of Navarre, later Henry IV, followed Clovis and converted to Catholicism. He had been a Huguenot, possibly uttering the words, "Paris is worth a mass," a sentiment felt by many tourists for centuries afterwards. Henry's Bourbon dynasty would further shape the city. He built the Place des Vosges, an old and beautiful example of city planning, a peaceful respite from the bustle of the city. The square's houses are uniform, and the Place became a prototype for squares that would later be erected throughout Europe. Like Paris, the square would be a home for great ministers, the Duke of Sully, Cardinal Richelieu, and great artists, Victor Hugo, the contemporary architect Renzo Piano. Bourbon power was toppled by the French Revolution, which removed some of the city's imperial trappings. The fortress of the Bastille was destroyed. The royal crypt at Saint-Denis was ravaged. But Paris was still to reach its imperial apogee. It was the Corsican conqueror, Napoleon, who actually made Paris into the capital of an empire. Cartloads of artistic plunder were brought back to the Louvre. The Revolution had converted the erstwhile palace into a public museum. The Arc de Triomphe celebrates Napoleon's victories. His nephew, Napoleon III, would continue the imperial transformation of the city. Napoleon III was a far less impressive general than his uncle, but an even more impressive city builder. During his years, Baron Georges Eugene Haussmann, the prefect of the Seine, completely transformed the city. Gone was the warren of medieval streets. Paris would have broad boulevards, impressive for strolling along, useful for cavalry trying to break an urban revolt. The boulevards were often named after military victories. Haussmann's Paris would have fresher water and better sewers. It would have parks such as the Bois de Boulogne. It would have new railway stations and the largest theatre in the world. Paris didn't have to pay for these marvels itself. The emperor could call on the wealth of the entire nation. Emperors often seem to think that the purpose of their rural hinterland is to glorify their own home city. The process may not be particularly fair, but it can produce splendor. The era of imperial palace really ended with Napoleon III's defeat at the hands of the Prussians on the battlefield of Sedan. The city itself endured a painful siege. The Parisians famously ate their zoo animals, such as the two elephants Castor and Pollux. The Germans earned the opprobrium of the world for shelling the beautiful city. Thanks to that war, the old church of Saint-Pierre on Montmartre sits below the grand basilica of Sacré-Cœur. Sacré-Cœur is the most recent of Paris's major religious landmarks. The church commemorates the dead of the Franco-Prussian War, but it also carries a clerical message. The Archbishop of Paris meant it to expiate the crimes of the Paris Commune. The working-class neighborhood of Montmartre had risen during the Franco-Prussian War, and the Archbishop was not pleased that the Communards had executed his predecessor. In a sense, Sacré-Cœur represents the last victory in stone of the clerical side of imperial Paris. Paris survived 3 major wars with Germany, but its leaders never again embraced empire with the same gusto. The city's goal became preservation, not new grandiosity. When Paris built a skyscraper after World War II, it was seen as a horror. But perhaps preservation is the right thing for Paris. Its imperial past has certainly left it with plenty to preserve.